Emma, very difficult, I guess, to sum up 3 years of psychological stress for so many people and relationship damage. Can I take you back to that day, this day, 3 years ago? What was your first reaction when you heard Boris Johnson say you must stay at home?
Well, I suppose it was disbelief and a bit of astonishment because it was something entirely new and no one had ever told me that I wasn't allowed to do certain things in the way that I was used to being able to do. So I guess for the first week, I just got my head down and got on with it. I didn't really feel it was necessary. But then by week 3, I started to speak out about the fact that firstly, you don't lock up abusers with their children. Secondly, you certainly don't affect poverty even further than we know it was going to be affected by the ordinary economy. And most importantly, in a democratic society where we have a level of autonomy over our choices, no one really had a right to do that. And with education in particular being affected as well, I think I was very blindsided at the end because what I felt was automatically anybody who dared to say that psychological well-being, children's needs, safeguarding is important, was immediately vilified and called a murderer. So I think I went through that initial 3 weeks in disbelief, shock, and also a kind of positivity that it'll all be over pretty immediately. And then, of course, it didn't, and it wasn't, and it's been catastrophic.
After that, I think it was about the second lockdown, because of course the first lockdown, we can argue whether that was necessary or not. At the time, perhaps with the information, one might argue it was necessary. Boris Johnson said in that speech, didn't he, we got 3 weeks. Obviously, the repeated lockdowns and changing the goalposts and changing those deadlines, we know from the WhatsApp messages that was not scientifically based whatsoever. But I remember saying on social media, Emma, that I feel like I'm in an abusive relationship with the government because they were using those sorts of coercion techniques, and I got roundly vilified for that. But just talk a little bit about how the parallels existed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was certainly an immediate division in our society. And I think that one of the most powerful things that the government did was they used fear, and fear is very, very effective. It's what they use in cults. I mean, they make you do lots of different rituals that are completely unnecessary to convince you that there's a reason behind the actual changes to your behaviour and that it's going to protect you. And then you see in society that what happens is that with social media, and there's been a huge connection between big government, big tech, you were put in a place where the world around you decided that it was acceptable to be really abusive, really hostile, and to actually ignore the main emphasis of the messages that you and I, for example, were trying to get across, which is no one wants anybody to die. But actually what we're thinking about is the long-term impact, particularly on children. I remember a speech of mine being read out of government, and there was a line in it saying that safeguarding has been abandoned, and the aim of safeguarding is to protect the most vulnerable from abuse, harm and neglect. And actually what we were doing was instilling abuse, harm and neglect on the most vulnerable populations. So still to this day, I'm absolutely stunned that we went into the initial lockdown because that was never the plan initially when you were dealing with a pandemic. Secondly, it didn't make any sense. We all know it didn't make any sense. But most importantly, there was a war on the freedom of thought. And even now, even today, that war on the freedom of thought is something that's really impacted on children and young people, because the messages are you're not allowed to think as an individual. You think as a host, you think as a horde, but you do not think as an individual, because if you do, you'll be critically analysed, you'll be vilified, and at times you'll actually be isolated and abandoned by the very society that's meant to welcome you. So I think it's not just the obvious psychological damage. I work in this area. I know exactly what the psychological damage is, and the whitewash of studies coming out right now denying that harm that everybody in this field knows has occurred. I know that there is a concerted effort to make it seem that there wasn't an impact on suicidality, self-harm and all the other areas. So this is a long-term impact of truth essentially being negated, and again, false science being initiated to carry a narrative that's done incredible damage. And what you said before, Bev, is exactly what should be noted. What happened to truth? What happened to admitting defeat? What happened to saying we've got to learn the lessons and the realities, we made horrible mistakes and these young people are going to pay for it very much generationally? At that point, you can start saying, at least we can leverage the harm and start moving forward. And it's just not happening.